Welcome to my channel. Today, we will meet a monster who became famous for being the scariest criminal in America. This man was called the Night Stalker, okay? And during the summer of 1984, he created hell in Los Angeles. You will not believe what he did. The main thing you need to understand about the Night Stalker is that he had a really messed up childhood. His parents were strict and they weren't able to show their son any love. So little Richard spent most of his time with his family listening to crazy stories about the most brutal crimes, which were told to him by his cousin, who had actually seen real war and even participated in the Vietnam War. That's why he brought back horrifying stories and pictures. Young Richard absorbed all of this. He also got interested in Satanism and even joined a gang. And instead of playing outside, he spent all of his time indoors, drawing creepy stuff and listening to metal music. When he was just 13 years old, he stole his first car. Then he dropped out of school and started dealing with drugs. He was only 14, and you might think this is where the story starts. But actually, this is where the real nightmare begins. In the late 1970s, Richard decided to leave his hometown and go to California. And there, he chose Los Angeles because it was a city full of opportunities, or at least that's what he thought. But once he settled down in LA, he realized that he needed money, so he started stealing cars. But then he began breaking into houses and apartments, but not to steal anything. Of course, he did steal money and jewelry, but that wasn't his motivation. He was just obsessed with being sneaky. That's why he studied how locks worked, how alarms could be avoided, and how to move like a shadow in the night. In the meantime, Los Angeles was booming. Hollywood stars glittered on billboards, music poured out of clubs, and suburban families enjoyed their American dream. It seemed like nothing could disturb the city's rhythm. But then, everything changed. In 1984, suddenly, reports of brutal home invasions started appearing in newspapers. People were shocked and scared. Every day, news stories appeared in the media about another brutal murder. It seemed like the murderer was invisible. A sea struck fear into everyone's hearts, okay? And in the end, the media named him the Night Stalker. What's really scary is that there was no pattern to the crimes. He attacked young and old, men and women from different neighborhoods, attacking them while they were asleep in their own beds. He tied them up, beat them, and tortured them. Then he stole money and jewelry, and sometimes he even returned home with his victims and continued torturing them there. And he also liked to leave weird signs at the crime scene, like pentagrams or upside-down crosses, which symbolized Satanism. In addition to all of this, he used to come back to his victims after a few days and attack them again. And since he was extremely cruel, he did terrible things to his victims, leaving them traumatized forever. And it seemed like the police had no chance to catch him. The first victim was Maria Hernandez. It was March 1984 when she heard a noise and went out into the hallway to check. She noticed that the door to her apartment next door was wide open. She knocked on the door, and when she heard a response, she opened the door and entered the apartment. And that's where she met the most horrible sight of her life. The room was completely destroyed. There was blood everywhere. On the floor, she saw a man lying face down and tied up. His head was wrapped in a blanket. But the worst part was that next to the man, she saw a pair of feet sticking out from under the bed. They were tiny feet, but the killer had already noticed the woman, and he began coming towards her. The woman screamed, ran out of the house, and called the police. She had no idea that that night she escaped death, but she managed to describe the criminal who had already killed 3 people, and the search began. But it was doomed to fail. The Night Stalker was simply too smart for the police, and over the next few months, he continued his crimes. He was striking terror in the hearts of people, and the police still had no leads. However, despite the fact that the police couldn't stop him, they still had hope. But unfortunately, Ramirez was prepared for that. In June 1984, he broke into an elderly couple's house, but then he did something unforgivable. He tied up the husband and forced him to watch as he was raping his wife. And in the end, he shot both of them. At the same time, evidence was piling up against the criminal and witnesses were giving similar descriptions. They said that he was either a black or Hispanic man between 25 and 30 years old. About 5'6", skinny, with a mustache and long curly hair. However, Richard knew how to avoid the police and slip through their fingers. But in August, he decided to break into a house belonging to a former Miss Hawaiian Tropic contestant. He tied her up and began asking for money. During that time, he talked a lot, and the woman learned that he was a total psychopath who did all of this to get high on adrenaline. But she also paid attention to every detail he said, and she was able to memorize what he looked like. Said when he left, she immediately called the police and gave him a detailed description. Also, this time, Richard made a huge mistake. He forgot his wallet at the crime scene, so police tested the fingerprints, and the wallet was definitely his, but they had no idea who it belonged to. But that wouldn't last for long. On September, Richard broke into a house and killed 5 people. Everyone was shocked by such a brutal crime. But little did Richard know that this would be his last mistake. After the attack, the police launched a massive manhunt, but still didn't have much to go on. Then one day, the police received an anonymous tip that a person matching the suspect's description was seen driving a stolen car. Officers spotted the car and followed it, and soon learned that the driver was Richard Ramirez. They pursued him for quite a while, but he managed to get away, and then the police found the car abandoned in an alley. They searched it thoroughly and lifted a single fingerprint. It wasn't a complete success, but it was enough. At the station, the fingerprint experts were able to determine that the fingerprint belonged to Richard. And finally, the police had a name. Richard was clueless. He continued his crimes for a few more days, but in October, the police released his photo to the public. That day, his life changed dramatically. Richard Ramirez walked through the streets of East Los Angeles without a shred of fear. He had no idea that everywhere he went, people pointed fingers at him, whispering his name. He could hear the words Night Stalker, Monster, and Devil spoken with hatred. He was being watched, followed, and photographed. Richard Ramirez had become a wanted man. At that point, he had committed 13 murders, 11 sexual assaults, and dozens of burglaries. And he still had no idea that the whole city was looking for him. He was walking among them, laughing at the danger that loomed around him. He knew he was committing crimes, but he was still happy. He loved the fear that gripped people. But then, suddenly, Richard was surrounded by a crowd. He could hear their shouts and see their angry faces. And that's when the neighbors took matters into their own hands. They jumped on Richard and beat him. Then they called the police, who arrived just in time to see him lying on the ground, covered in blood. That's how the reign of the Night Stalker ended. He was taken to the hospital, then to jail. Over the next few years, Richard refused to attend his trial. He sat silently, smiling at the cameras and making strange gestures. When he finally faced justice, he was sentenced to death. But that didn't stop him from receiving fan mail in prison. He had admirers who sent him messages of love and support. Many people even asked for autographs, and it seemed that Richard Ramirez had become some kind of cult figure. And although he was executed in 2013, his legacy remains. Richard Ramirez was known as the Night Stalker, and he showed the world that crime and fear can come from the most unexpected places. If you want to learn more about similar cases, check out our videos on the infamous Jack the Ripper. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more updates.